When I was a kid, I grew up with a perspective of God that was built on this concept. Just close your eyes and believe. And here's what I mean by that. I grew up in a home and in a setting and in an environment where I had a lot of spiritual people and a lot of input into what it meant to interact and relate to God. But at some point in my life along the way, some of the things that I grew up believing were hard for me to continue believing. The more I learned, the more I studied, the more that I experienced life. And one of the things that I actually went through a period of my life is I walked away from faith completely and believed myself to be an atheist. Believed that there was no God and that the story of faith in my childhood really was simply that, a story of my childhood. And then around my kind of junior year of high school and really leading into my first years of college, I began to engage in a faith and an understanding of Jesus and the good news that was not built off of simple childhood stories, but on real study and understanding. And what I found was compelling and what made me upset was that I did not hear these things growing up as a kid. And I committed that if I ever was put in a position where I was leading a church or was able to communicate to people about Jesus, I would communicate Jesus to people in a way that I thought would have been helpful for me had somebody had told me those things when I was younger. So as we jump into this series, Quittin' Religion, I just have a confession to make. This has been my journey. I have had to quit religion along the way, and I have had to learn how to follow Jesus instead. And this is the beauty of the resurrection. This is the beauty of what we celebrated last Easter, and it's what the beauty of what we celebrate every Sunday when we get together. It's this truth, that Jesus' resurrection is our invitation to quit religion. And by religion, this is what I mean, a set of beliefs that are built on rules, on rituals, and if we're honest, some degree of rejection. The rules, we all know what that was like maybe growing up as a kid. God is this kind of entity. You do these things, you don't do these things, and God will love you. Rituals, you go to these places, you spend this amount of money, you serve in these certain ways. For some of us, those rituals looked like you had to go to a priest and you had to confess all of the bad stuff that you did to the priest, and the priest would give you some prayers to pray, and then you didn't really pray the prayers, but you hoped to kind of work because you went to the priest, right? That kind of situation. For some others of us, it wasn't about that. It was about the rules, right? It was what you could wear, what you couldn't wear, right? What you could watch, what you couldn't watch, what you could listen to, what you couldn't listen to. Like some of you grew up in the era, right, where there was something called devil music, right? And that's pretty much everything we play on Sunday mornings now, right? That's what it was. And then for me growing up, it wasn't so much about that. It was what you watched. So I grew up in the era of Pokemon being the end of the world. Do y'all remember this? Anybody remember this? Like there's this like movement, right? That was like Pokemon is the Antichrist. And I was like, that is like the cutest little Antichrist ever. Like if that's what it is, right? And then 20 years later, we're still here, right? And then you've got this piece around rejection, which was probably the biggest struggle for me. The biggest struggle for me about faith growing up as a kid and working it out as an adolescent is that the things that I grew up believing as a child, right? How prayer works or how the world was made. My 7-year-old mind, right, was taught that the world was made in a certain way, but then my 15-year-old biology brain, when I went to school, was taught something categorically different. And I couldn't reconcile what I could see and examine and study in the scientific world with what I was learning and I was growing up with as a kid. And here's the thing that you know, right? You know this, right? That there are things that you believed as a child that you no longer believe. That there were fairy tales that you believed. We're not going to, share what those fairy tales are here. You can do that, parents, on your own time and crush your own kid's dream. But there are fairy tales that we believed growing up as kids that we no longer believed. Like I had an invisible friend. Don't make fun of me for it. I had an invisible friend when I was 6. It would be weird if I had an invisible friend at 16, right? That would be a little bit weird. And so here's what happens, right? Our childhood faith cannot keep up with our adult questions often. But as we grew up, the examples and the arguments and the perspectives that we were given as kids about how God relates in the world, who God is, and what God does did not keep up with the adult questions that we were experiencing when we were in middle school or high school or in college. Because our childhood faith taught us to simply close our eyes and just believe. You've just got to believe. But here's the thing about belief, and you know this about belief, is that you cannot believe something that you do not believe. You can try as hard as you want to believe it, but at some point you've just got to acknowledge, man, I just don't. I just don't believe. And so for some of you right now in this room, you find yourself either walking away from faith or having walked away from faith, not because you wanted to, but because if you're honest with yourself, you had to. You could not reconcile a world that you could see. You could not reconcile a world that was grounded in logic. You could not reconcile a world that was grounded in science with these fairy tale childhood stories of your faith growing up as a kid. And here's what we realize, is that if all we have are these childhood stories, man, those are not going to work in our adult realities. But what's so cool about the resurrection, and what's so cool about Christian faith, and what's so cool about following Jesus, is that Jesus does not invite us to stay with a childhood faith. In fact, Jesus' way is a little bit different. Jesus' way embraces science and logic. There's actually a framework of faith that embraces science and logic. Jesus allows us to ask questions without fear. Jesus isn't afraid of our doubts or our wonders. We're allowed to wonder and to doubt and to still be a part of Jesus' family. And Jesus invites us to belong far before we ever believe. And here's why this is so important. This is so important because for some of us in the room, we need to quit religion because the religion that we are currently following is not the way of Jesus. For others of us, we quit every version of faith and we're here as a favor to our spouse. We're here because maybe that's going to give us our kids some good moral foundation or fabric. We're here because this is a good place to make friends in Lake Nona and it's way cheaper than a country club, right? Like there are reasons why you might be here that have nothing to do with Jesus. And I would invite you to reconsider him. I would invite you to reconsider the claims of the Christian faith, not because I want you to move back into a 7-year-old mind, but because your adult mind could actually be incredibly compelled by the stuff that's real. And beyond that, I think this conversation is super important for those of us who do believe and are wondering, why are we going to spend the next couple of weeks talking about a God that I can't see, a church that I won't trust, and a Bible that I can't believe? Because you're sitting here thinking, I do believe in the Bible, I'm good with the church, and I don't have to see God to believe in him. Why are we going to spend this time doing this? And here's the thing, you need to know. You need to know that this is of utmost importance and value to your life because somebody you love is asking these questions right now. My doctoral work is in studying Generation Z. This is the generation that is after millennials starting in 1996. And if you're a parent of any child that was born after 1996, you need to know this, is that all of the data shows is that where millennials stand as it pertains to their perspective of God, the number of atheists, that number is double in Generation Z and even double among kids that are the younger part of that generation. That their worldview is framed out in a way where God does not exist and there is no compelling reason to believe in God. And if I'm honest, many of you are experiencing this right now with your kids. If you're a parent, you know this. If you're a grandparent, you know this. If you're an aunt or if you're an uncle, you need to know this. Because here's the deal. Close your eyes and just believe is not compelling enough for any adult, and it's not compelling enough for most kids today because of this thing in their pocket called a phone and this really weird friend named Google, all right? They have access to way more information than they ever have, and your simple childhood explanations are not going to be enough for them to believe. In the last week in my home alone, my kids have asked me the following questions. They are 6 and they are 8, all right? Pray for your boy, all right? These are the questions that they have asked, okay? Why did God have a son and not a daughter? Okay? Anybody want that one? How can God be 3 people and be one identity? If everything has a beginning, what was God's beginning? This is the last week, y'all, all right? One of my favorites this week was, God, do dogs go, or Dad, do dogs go to heaven? Simple answer, yes, and cats don't. Like, that was a pretty easy one for me. The last one, how are babies made? Let me tell you, when the question, how are babies made, is the easiest question you get to answer during the week, you got your work cut out for you. So we live in a world that is asking these questions, and your simple, the Bible says, is not going to be compelling enough for kids. And let's be honest, it's never been compelling enough for you either. So we're going to ask these questions. Why should I trust in a God I can't see? Why should I trust in a church that I don't want to trust? And how can I believe in a Bible that is just so hard to believe? We're going to answer these questions over the next couple of weeks because these questions are the questions that your kids and the people you love are asking. And if you're honest, these are the questions that you ask too and are so afraid to even explore. And I've got some good news for you. The more you explore it, the more that you find out, wow, God really is who he says he is. And it's going to be okay. Today we're going to look at a writer by the name of Paul. And the reason why we're going to look at a passage that Paul writes in his letter to the church in Rome, Romans chapter 1, verse 19 to 23 is where we'll be. The reason why we're going to look at Paul today is because I know that for some of you who are skeptics, the idea that we would even start this argument as to why God exists from the Bible is like, I'm out. But here's the thing that you need to know, is that the Bible isn't just a book. The Bible is written by a number of historically verifiable figures who had real stories, real lives, and who had real perspectives on things. And as we read Paul, for some of us, the authority of the Bible is enough, and start there, that's great. For others of us, if that's not where you stand, let Paul's life alone allow you to lean in. Paul was one of the wealthiest men that lived during his time and his age. He was educated by a man by the name of Gamaliel, who was a rabbi and a teacher and a scientist, one of the most brilliant minds during that day. In fact, to become a student of Gamaliel meant that you were the smartest and the sharpest. He not only was a Jewish man, but he was also a Roman citizen who had incredible amounts of access to power and to wealth and to influence. And he left every single part of that because he had an experience with a resurrected Jesus that changed his life. In fact, Paul hated Christians before he became a Christian and killed them and oversaw their martyrdom and the murder of them in droves because they were going to undermine the fabric of the cultural strength and power that made him who he was. And yet he leaves all of that, his wealth, his power, his influence. He leaves all of that because he meets a resurrected Jesus. And beyond that, when he writes this letter to the church in Rome, a couple of years later, he'll write to his protege, Timothy, I've run the race. He said, I'm being poured out like a drink offering, and he would be beheaded by the Roman Empire. And all he had to do to maintain his life was simply recant and say, I did not see Jesus resurrected, but he could not say that because he did, and he died as a result. So let's pay attention to the 4 verses that we're going to look at today. This is what Paul says. This is Paul's explanation about why we can trust in a God that we can't see. He says this. The human condition, humanity, knew the truth about God because, look at this. This is such a bold statement. That humanity can know the truth about God because he's made it obvious to them. So Paul's argument here is that you don't have to believe in God because it's mysterious or mystical. You can believe in God because it's right in front of your face. He goes on to say this, for ever since the world was created, people have seen, so he's appealing to the senses, he's appealing to science here, people have seen the earth and the sky. He's appealing to natural elements, that which you can study. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power, and his divine nature, so they have no excuse for not knowing God. So Paul, thousands of years before science is even beginning its kind of iteration as we know it to be so compelling and so powerful. Paul, before we've got, the scientific method introduced. Paul, before, what we know about discovery is even close to in play. Paul says the most compelling argument and the only compelling argument you need to know and have to know that God exists is to open your eyes and see. All you have to do is look at what you can see, taste, touch, feel, and smell, and that is enough compelling evidence to prove that there is a God. Here's his point. What you experience with your eyes is evidence that God exists. What you see with your eyes is evidence that God exists. Anybody like cars? Anybody a car fan in here? Okay, I'm going to throw a car up here on the screen. Anybody know what kind of car that is? Anybody? It's a Ferrari. We got one rich person in the house. Awesome. It is a Ferrari. Good job. Good job. Now, here's the thing about a Ferrari, okay? When you look at that Ferrari, right? Anybody think, that's a nice car. I might not. I like driving that. Some of you guys are like, no, the insurance is too high. And it's like, well, it's too bad for you. I hope your life gets better, all right? I like the Ferrari, all right? Here's the thing about the Ferrari. No one looks at that Ferrari and says, wow, that's a great car, and stops there. And if you do, you're missing the fact that somebody had to think up that car. Somebody had to draw out its iterations on paper. Somebody had to collect a group of people to build that thing. Somebody had to put an engine in it and figure out how it all works so that it can actually drive and go from 0 to 60 in an unlawful speed, right? Like that is what you look at. No one would look at that and say, oh, it just happened. Everyone would say that was made. Let's look at this next photo. It's the Burj Khalifa. The Burj Khalifa is one of the most beautiful, tall buildings in the entire world. The architecture is immaculate. The visuals are pristine. It is a gorgeous, gorgeous building. Nobody looks at that and looks up into the sky and simply says, oh, that just happened. Everyone looks at that and says, wow, what an incredible building that is. Somebody must have architected that. Somebody must have designed that. I would love to have dinner with that designer, right? No one looks at the Burj Khalifa and simply thinks, oh, that building exists, and no one caused it to happen. Any Lego fans out there? Any Lego people? You've got some Legos on your chairs. Go and pick them up. I want you to kind of hold them for a second if you can. I am a Lego fan, and my boys are beginning to fall in love with Legos, and I love this because having young children who want to play with Legos allows you to be a child without having to admit that you're a child. The only downside to Legos, right, is when it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you step on like one of them, right, and then you say things out of your mouth that no pastor should ever say. Never happens to me. Never happens to me, right? Like that's like the only downside to them. Here's what I think is so interesting. My buddy, Jonathan Duggins, Jonathan's an awesome guy. Jonathan built this pirate ship that's up here on the stage with his boys. There are 2,700 component parts to this pirate ship, and it took him 5 hours to build it. It's pretty impressive, right? Here's what I love about Jonathan is that Jonathan knew that simply having it on stage wouldn't be enough. So he went the extra mile, and he took professional photos of his creation. So that right there is Jonathan's pirate ship. Here's another close-up photo. I just like the energy of the guy that's there. It's like he almost has a soul, even though he's plastic, right? And then the last one, who doesn't love Batman on a cow? That's always a good day. Now, here's the thing, all right? I want you to answer this question for me, okay? Let's just be logical thinking beings for 1 minute, all right? You've got some Legos there in your bag. I want you to do this with me. Go ahead and shake those Legos like this. Good. Okay, now stop. I want you to look at your Legos for a minute, if you can. Did your Legos create anything in there by any chance? Like, is there a little person in there? Is there a little house? Is there a little car? Is there anything like that? No. All right, so let's say that this was reflective of 2,700 component parts of Legos, right? How long would I have to shake this box in order for the things to come together, the matter to just be right, the circumstances to be just correct, in order for this that's right here to create something like that? Would that ever happen, yes or no? No, it wouldn't happen, right? What is more logical and more probable? That something like a pirate ship gets built or that it randomly happens? You tell me, which one's more probable? It's probable that it is made, right? So here's the thing. We believe that about cars. We believe that about buildings. We believe that about pretty much everything in the world. We believe that about a simple pirate ship. Yet when we look at the universe and when we look at the cosmos, how do we come to the conclusion that the most complex thing that has ever existed would simply be formed by chance? So here's Paul's argument. Paul's argument is, listen, you don't have to see God to know that God exists. Just look at what God has made. Because if it's made, it means that there is a maker. Now, I know that this is a rudimentary example. I'm aware of that. Maybe some of you guys can use this with your kids at some day. But here's what I think is so interesting, is that Robert Jasnowski, who is a world-renowned physicist, he died in 2008, I mean, one of the most brilliant minds of our era, who was not a Christian, found this to be true in the final years of his life. This is what he writes. He says, astronomers, so now we're moving from Legos to the broader, we're talking about the cosmos and the universe. He says, astronomers now find that they have painted themselves into a corner because they have proven by their own methods that the world began abruptly in an act of creation, to which you can trace the seeds of every star, every planet, every living thing in this cosmos and on the earth. And they have found that all this happened as a product of forces they cannot hope to discover. Meaning there is a force that acted to create this universe that cannot be quantified, cannot be qualified, and cannot be discovered. It is an impossible pursuit. That there are what I or anyone would call supernatural forces at work is now, I think, a scientifically proven fact. So here's the bottom line. Everything has a creator. All of science agrees that at the point of singularity, there was a moment where the universe was created. The universe has not always been. It was created, and there was a moment. Everything has a creator. The universe was created, which means the universe has a creator. And there's no doubt about that. And you don't have to see the creator to be aware that there is a creator, because all you have to do is look at the creation. And here's the thing. I didn't grow up learning this. I grew up learning something very different. I grew up with a perspective on God that was like, hey, if you can't explain it, just believe it's God. Hey, just close your eyes and believe and just will yourself into belief. But at the end of the day, we can't do that. And you don't have to do that. You don't have to lead your kids that way. You can give them a rational, scientific process to believe in the creator of the universe. And here's what you need to know as well. Is that the scientific method, all of these things that we use to discover science as it works and to examine the world, all of these things actually find their genesis, actually find their origins in Christian faith. Because Christianity is the first worldview that assumes that God created a universe that is rational, that is lawful, and stable, which means it can be studied. You can't study something that can't be predicted. You can't study something that you can put laws around. And the only worldview in all of human history that engaged and believed in this narrative is the worldview of Christianity. It is the orientation and the origin of this perspective. That's why some of the world's greatest scientists have always been followers of Jesus. That's why some of the greatest scientific schools and medical facilities have always been built off of and been inspired by Christian faith. So I don't know if you grew up with anti-science God like I did, but I kind of grew up in this world where it's like science is the big, bad, evil, like thing trying to disprove God. And it was like, no, like that couldn't be further from the truth. Science does not disprove God. Science simply explains how God did what he did, and we don't have to be afraid of it. And in fact, Christians, stop being so hypocritical when it comes to science. Because guess what? When you're sick, you're praying. But guess what you're also doing? Going to the doctor who is a scientist. Science doesn't disprove God. It simply explains how God did what he did. Dr. Francis Collins, who is the leader of the human genome, he is the man who mapped the human genome, our DNA. He says this. He says Science is simply mankind trying to understand the greatness of God's design. And so when you see a sunset, when your eyes are lifted up and you catch a sunset on a Tuesday night, I want you to look at that sunset and realize that as you're looking at that sunset, this is what is happening. Your eyes are 576 megapixel cameras that are relating with your brain, which has the power of a 31,000 gigahertz computer, and that you are staring at a sun that is 92.26 million miles away. And if it was a couple of miles closer, it would burn you to death. And if it was a couple miles further away, it would be frozen, and we could not have life here on earth. And while I'm talking right now, and while you're looking at that sunset, 50 million cells in your body are dying and being replenished simultaneously at the same time, while you are standing on a rock perfectly positioned from the sun in the middle of the universe that sustains life, that weighs 5.97 sextillion tons, rotating around the sun at 67,000 miles per hour. And when you look at all of that, I want you to recognize and realize that there's a creator of the universe that knows you by name and holds it all together. And what I think is so funny, right, is like some of us, especially those of us who are skeptical, we're like, man, if I could have just been with Jesus, right? Like if I could have saw Jesus walk on water, then I would believe, right? If I could just see Jesus, like, take a couple of fish, take a couple of loaves and multiply it. Or if I could see Jesus multiply my bank account, right? If I could see Jesus, like if I could just see him do those things, then I would believe. No, you wouldn't. Because you are the miracle right now. Life is the miracle, and it was made by God. We have all the evidence that we need right here in this room right now that there is a God. Paul puts it this way. He diagnoses our issue. The issue is not that it's hard to believe that there is a God even though we can't see a God. The issue is not with God. The issue is with us. Look at what Paul says in Romans 1:21. He said, yes, they knew God, meaning that they knew about him. They had an awareness of him. But they wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. And as a result, their minds became dark and confused. Claiming to be wise, this is human nature, they instead became utter fools. And instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshiped idols made to look like mere people and birds and animals and reptiles. And remember, Paul is writing this to the people in Rome. So when he says that they are worshiping things that look like people, animals, and reptiles, he's literally talking about the Roman gods that were statues that were a combination of people and reptiles, a human head and an animal's body, a woman's legs and an animal's torso. This is what he's talking about. He's talking about in Roman culture, instead of looking at the creator, they worshiped the created things. They fashioned these gods that were statues that had no power and no real purpose, and yet people went and worshiped them. And we look at that today as modern people and think how ridiculous, right? How ridiculous that you would walk up to a stone sculpture and statue that human hands made and say, oh, this is God, let me offer a sacrifice to it. Of course, we think that that's absurd. But let me ask you this. While we don't worship things like that necessarily as much today, do you think it's kind of worship when you're so focused on your bank account, a created thing instead of the creator? You think it's kind of worship when you're focused on your followers on social media, when that's a created thing instead of the creator? Do you think it's idol worship when you focus on your own physical health more than you focus on the one who's given you your physical health? Do you think it could be idol worship if we focus on the neighborhood we live in, the success of our kids, the quality of their soccer club that they're in, the zip code that we reside in, the reputation that we have, and the promotion that we get? Could it be that you and I are no different than the people 2,000 years ago that are simply worshiping created things instead of the creator? That when you and I drop our eyes on anything less than God, when we give our value and our emotional energy to anything less than God, this is what Paul says happens. He says that you and I become foolish, our hearts become darkened, and we act like fools. And let's be real, some of y'all been acting like fools. Why? Because the stress you feel usually has to do with the fact that your eyes are not on God, but on something created. That worry you feel usually has to do with the fact that your eyes are not on God, but on something that he's created. That anxiety that keeps you up late at night usually is connected, unless it's a medically diagnosable reality, it's usually connected to something that you are focusing on that is not God himself. And every single time we drop our eyes and focus on the creation instead of the creator, we lose it and we miss it. St. Augustine of Hippo, an African theologian, I think puts it so well when he says, our hearts are restless. Your heart is restless until it finds its rest in God. You're not going to find rest when the promotion comes. You're not going to find rest when the diagnosis comes back the way you want it to be. You're not going to find rest when your kids finally turn out the way that you want them to be, and you're not going to find rest when everything goes the way you want it to go, because there will be another thing for you to worship that is not God. You will only find rest when you fix your eyes on your Creator. So there's two groups of people in the room. First one is followers of Jesus. If you're a follower of Jesus, here's a question I want you to consider and work through over the week as we journey through this process of quitting religion, because some of us who are followers of Jesus are still holding on to rules and rituals and rejecting things we do not need to reject to earn God's love, and you need to just let it go. I want you to ask this question. Does my lifestyle confirm that my hope is in my Creator or in what he's created? I mean, does my checkbook really communicate that I value God more than everything else? Does my calendar really communicate that I value God more than anything else? Or would my checkbook and my calendar and my time and my energy actually communicate what I value most is me and a world that revolves around me? And if you're unsure about what to believe about Jesus, and maybe in the room today you would say, yeah, you made a compelling argument that God has created the world and there's a God that exists, but that does not mean that that God is Jesus. I get it. I'm with you. I've been there before. You are in good company. But here's the question I would ask you. What if Jesus really meant it when he said he was God? What if that wasn't a joke? What if it wasn't just some cute words, but it actually happened? And here's the thing. I believe you're a rational person. I believe that you are a person who values logic and thought and clear conclusions. And if that's where you are today, this is the question that I want you to process. What if Jesus really meant it? Because if he really meant it and he really was, it has profound implications on every aspect of your life. It means that you are loved without condition. It means that you are loved no matter what. It means that you are fully known by the creator of the entire universe. And that Jesus when he said, I'm going to die and defeat death, that when he defeated death, it meant you could defeat all of your shame and guilt as well. And I want you to wrestle this to the ground over the course of this series, and don't let go until you have. How do you reconcile the fact that there were hundreds of eyewitnesses who saw Jesus die and then saw him rise and declared that they did? How do you reconcile the fact that in the city of Jerusalem, the epicenter of first century Judaism, thousands of people, some estimate up to 30 to 40% of the city, converted to follow Jesus weeks after seeing that man crucified by Rome because enough people had seen him resurrected? How do you leave centuries, if not thousands of years of tradition because of a rabbi from Nazareth? It's not because of his teaching. It's got to be because of something better, because he's resurrected. And why didn't Rome just reveal the body? Why, when this movement began picking up and people said, oh, he's resurrected, why is it that they didn't just walk to the tomb, pull out the body, show everybody that Jesus was dead? Why did they do that? Because they couldn't, because he wasn't there. And why did the writers, including Paul, who we learned about today, why would the writers simply have to say, I made it up, it's not true, I recant? Why did every single one of them on different continents, never seeing each other again, all lose their life? Not because Jesus was a good teacher, but because they would not stop talking about what they had seen and what they had heard, a resurrected Jesus. You don't have to walk away from faith. You don't have to place it behind you. You don't have to reject faith because of the stories of your childhood. No, you are invited into an adult faith that asks real questions with real answers, where there's room for doubt and there is a place for you. That is the invitation of Jesus.